welcome to Healing Higher Education, Race, Reckoning, and Reimagining. Before we begin, we'll start with a brief practice. Sitting comfortably in your chairs, feet planted firmly on the ground wherever you find yourself in this moment. Hands relaxed. Take a deep breath in. Take in the deepest breath you've taken all day. Exhale. Breathe deep. Exhale. Follow the rhythm of your breath. Notice in gratitude how your chest rises and falls out of love for you. You are here. Focus now on your ears. Listen deeply to these words from Alice Walker. In our despair that justice is slow, we sit with heads bowed, wondering how, even whether we will ever be healed. Perhaps it is a question only the ravaged, the violated ask seriously. And is that not now almost all of us? But hope is on the way. Hope is on the way. Breathe in hope. Exhale fear. Breathe in healing. Exhale hurt. Remember, hope is on the way. When you are ready, I invite you to come back to us. We'll begin tonight's program. Good evening and welcome again. Welcome to Confronting the Issues, the first conversation in the Healing Higher Education, Race, Reckoning, and Reimagining series. My name is David Robinson Morris, and I'm pleased to serve as the Executive Director in service to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, more commonly known as CMind. CMind is a global community of practitioners and scholars working at the intersection of contemplative justice and higher education to inspire, to engage, and to support the integration of contemplative practices and understandings in our everyday living toward the development of a more just world, a deepened understanding of our shared humanity, our responsibility to the planet, and the production of new knowledges. We convene conferences, we organize seminars and lectures, we facilitate workshops, and we form communities of practice with relevant experts, scholars, and practitioners with diverse interests and backgrounds. We envision ourselves as a conduit of individual, collective, systemic, and institutional transformation, where society is transformed through an active engagement in contemplative practices and understandings, which make possible radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation. We envision institutions of higher learning and a society that practices compassion, that pursues justice, and that acts in ways that honor our shared humanity. Tonight's program and this series is just a small glimpse into the work we are endeavoring to do to make radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation possible. As a faculty member and former university administrator, I can tell you firsthand that higher education as a system is in crisis. As I wrote in the series description, not only is the system and the institutions that compose the system are in crisis, so too are the individuals within the system. We have only to open the New York Times, read the Chronicle of Higher Ed, chat with colleagues and friends working within higher education institutions, or chat with students to know that 3 years and counting of a global pandemic have brought the inequities, injustices, and inhumanity within our institutions of higher education to the forefront for our faculty, for our staff, students, and administrators. These issues, it's important to note, are not new. And the problems have become concretized in the everyday living of each institution. However, perhaps we have all finally reached the limits of our passive acceptance and are irresistibly compelled to act, to force a reckoning, and to begin to radically reimagine higher education by first transforming ourselves. What we know is the ways in which institutions and systems operate are choices. And each institution can make the choice to be, do otherwise. Now, more, never more than now. In the third year of a global pandemic and a nation being forced to reckon with its racist past, its unjust present, and to shape more just futures by the very people it continues to impress, there has been a clear mandate for healing higher education. Healing, as you know, is a practice and a continuous process. Healing systems is a continuous process of embodiment, of making incarnate the transformative work toward wholeness, toward compassion within ourselves first. So this attunement in body, in mind, and in spirit can alter every environment in which you might find yourselves planted. Nothing can be healed until it is faced, and nothing is faced in earnest until we tell the truth about it. Understanding the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, that the mind that got us into this mess cannot be the same mind that gets us out of it. This series seeks to utilize a contemplative lens to explore a singular question from multiple perspectives. Right? That question is this: given the current state of higher education, how might we catalyze a healing to transform higher education into what it is not yet, but must become, if we are to live together peacefully, respect the planet, and uplift the human spirit? Tonight's conversation, tonight's data-driven conversation, identifies, names, and brings us face to face with the issues that need to be confronted to begin the healing process. Borrowing from Bryan Stevenson, there can be no healing without telling the unvarnished truth. Tonight's conversation is designed to do just that. It's designed to tell the truth, to bring light through research, the issues of mental health, unjust economic structures, inequity, rampant on American college campuses. Now, you've heard enough from me. Allow me to introduce tonight's presenters, Dr. Hollie Chessman and Dr. Joy Blanchard. Dr. Chessman serves as the Director of Research and Practice at the American Council of Education, where she is responsible for ACE's portfolio of work on what college and university leaders need to know about student mental health and well-being. Prior to ACE, Dr. Chessman spent 17 years working in student affairs at Tulane University, Lake Erie College, Loyola University, New Orleans, and George Mason University. Her research interests focus on well-being among students and student affairs professionals, graduate student choice, student success, and race and ethnicity in higher education. Dr. Chessman, we welcome you to the CMind community. Dr. Joy Blanchard is Associate Professor of Higher Education at Louisiana State University. Dr. Blanchard's research focuses on higher education law, primarily issues related to intercollegiate athletics, negligence liability and student safety, and faculty rights. Prior to joining the faculty ranks, Dr. Blanchard worked in student affairs, having served as Assistant Dean of Students at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. She is also the editor of a book titled Controversies on Campus, Debating Issues Confronting American Universities in the 21st Century. Dr. Blanchard, we welcome you as well to the CMind community.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Before I turn the night over to Dr. Blanchard and Dr. Chessman, I want to remind all of you that you're able to ask questions of our presenters through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Dr. Blanchard, I'd like to invite you to kick us off tonight with brief opening remarks, followed by Dr. Chessman.
Thank you. And it's a really great pleasure to be invited to speak with you tonight. And I can let all of the attendees know that you're in for a treat. I got a sneak peek at some of the results from Dr. Chessman's study, and it truly hits on what we probably are noticing on our campuses. So David, I really appreciated our opening practice, because you continuously mentioned hope is on the way, and I really took note of that, because even though we're still in the midst of COVID, and of course there'll be the aftermath of COVID, thanks to vaccines and decreasing numbers, I personally feel like I can see some type of hope. When we were in the midst of this, so many of us thought, well, gosh, how long will this last? And I think we all thought 2 weeks at first, and it ended up being 2 years. So many of the topics that you mentioned already, I've jotted down, because the issue of hope and healing in higher education is just so multi-layered. For the people at the institutions, the faculty and staff, they have, particularly the staff, have been literally on the front lines, making sure that students and constituents are safe, and have the institutions been responsive to the needs of those who work on campuses. Faculty, we are re-emerging into, depending on the campus, either face-to-face instruction or maybe even some form of hybrid high flex, but we are re-emerging and learning how to, not just how to instruct post-COVID, but hopefully take some of the lessons that we learned when we were forced to retreat to our homes, and hopefully improve our practice of instruction. Institutions, so many issues there, from funding to enrollment, utilizing enrollment to supplant funding, utilize the faculty and staff in ways that could drain some of us through increased enrollment. I know my institution and some of the other institutions I've been at previously were very much enrollment driven in order to balance the budgets. And one thing in particular, and this was something I made note of personally when COVID first struck campuses, was public higher education was at such a critical point already, and it will really be incumbent upon institutions to really make a very strong claim, particularly in the public higher education sector, to our lawmakers and policymakers who may question our worth and our need in society, who might say, well, you were able to function via Zoom for a year. So why should you come back to campus? Why should we be paying for various services that we offer students via student affairs or mental health services or health services? So now more than ever, I think higher education is at a time in its industry where we're at a crossroads, where institutions have to decide what is their mission. Will they try to be all things to all people? I don't think they should be. I think there's a place in the market for everyone to specialize. But we're also at that point where we not just have to, prove ourselves to trustees and funding sources, but even prove ourselves to students as far as, what is our purpose in society and why it truly is still important to pursue a post-secondary education. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Chessman because obviously the research that she'll enlighten us with will organically spark some conversation. But so many of the things that her study found are things that I definitely have been noticing on my campus or interacting and speaking with students.
Thank you, Dr. Blanchard. So I think some of the things that you were just mentioning about higher education being in this critical juncture, right, where we have some looking inward to do and looking outward to do at our systems, our structures, our policies, our procedures, and things like that. And people are calling into question the public is calling into question the value of a higher education. ACE just recently did a survey with the Winston Group, and we're seeing that people are still seeing value in higher ed, but we are at a critical juncture where we should continue to build on that and continue to foster the value that higher education brings to society, because I think there is a value in higher education. While it's not the most perfect system, I feel like it's one of the best systems in the world to help with economic mobility and to help people reach and achieve a different place in life as they strive and work to do those things. I think one of the things that as I was listening to you speak, especially when you start with hope is on the way, David and Dr. Blanchard speaking about the hope is on the way. I feel like hope is on the way for higher ed, and we are seeing the great resignation, right? We're talking about this larger conversation of faculty and staff sort of leaving academia and staff saying, you know what, I'm done with the 60-hour work weeks and the late nights, and I can't do this anymore. I think we're at a place where we need to be thinking about how we do our work in a different way. We need to be thinking about what our students have different needs than they had even 10 years ago and even 5 years ago. With the pandemic, I think the needs of students have changed. And you see that in some of the data. If you look at the mental health data, I was at a convening of college and university presidents and the Mary Christie Institute at Georgetown University on Tuesday. And we talked a lot about this conversation around student mental health in particular, to talk about, 50% of college and university students are coming with clinical diagnosis, clinical symptoms of depression and anxiety, with anxiety far outweighing depression. And I think which is a symptom of what's happening in our world around the uncertainty, and which I'll get to in a few minutes. And I think the other thing that we are looking at as in higher education in particular is that it is a community, right? And we as people need to be in community. And I think the pandemic has shined the light on that in ways that we never would have anticipated, because we need to be among people. And higher education is a unique place where we are able to be among people, to live and learn together in ways that are in no other way that is, systems and structures that higher education provides gives us that ability to really sort of fruitfully and have really great conversations and cultivate that hope that Dr. Rosen Morris was talking about earlier. I think one of the things that I would say about the research that I'm about to present, which I will segue into here now, is that Really big shout out to Jane Kim, who is one of our graduate research associates at the American Council on Education. She did a really great job of looking across about 11 surveys and pulling in some of the threads that I think that are really important to highlight here to sort of speak to what the leaders of higher education are thinking about, what is the most pressing for them, because what's most pressing for them are the things that typically where our attention goes, right? And so thinking about, in the minute here, we'll talk about it, but looking at these issues and being able to talk about some of these issues and looking at it from a contemplative lens, I think is really important, because a lot of these issues that I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes can have a contemplative component applied to them to help what we're talking about in healing higher education. So with that, I'm going to transition, if that's okay, over to sharing my screen, which bear with me. At this point in our pandemic life, I should be pretty adept at sharing screens, but you never know. All right, so hopefully everybody can see that. Can you see my slide? Yeah, okay, perfect. So again, I'm Dr. Hollie Chessman, Director of Research and Practice at the American Council on Education. I identify myself as a practitioner researcher. Being in student affairs, 10 of those in housing and residence life sort of has really made me an advocate for applying research to practice. I'm at the American Council on Education, and those of you who don't know what ACE is, we are the coordinating body for higher ed associations in Washington, DC. We have organizations from across higher education that convene under our umbrella, and we go to the Hill to lobby on behalf of higher education. And so we've done things as gone to the Hill on DACA. We went to the Hill on doubling the Pell. So those are some of the more recent things that we've done. And we're advocating for higher education. We also are a research shop. We have a research shop, and which is I'm a member of. And we also have a program shop, and some of you might be familiar with the ACE Fellows program, which is a premier training program for people who are looking at C-suite leadership or the presidency. So ACE is a large organization. We represent 1,700 college and university presidents and related organizations, and we have about 2 out of every 3 students is actually on an ACE campus. So we represent a large amount of students in higher education. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the pressing issues that we're confronting. So the Pulsepoint Survey is a survey that we put out into the field during COVID. We saw before COVID, the Pulsepoint was one of those things that sort of we put into the field when there were critical issues to address. We did one on the racial campus climate during the student demands. We did one on free speech and inclusion with a lot of some of the divisive speech that was happening on campus early on. And now we were at a juncture with COVID to say, hey, we've got this really critical issue happening in higher education. We need to understand it. We need to provide context for our leaders as they confront this issue head on. And so what we did is we fielded a survey every couple of months to sort of gauge the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And it was the team of researchers, we would come together, we put our heads together and come up with questions every couple months to sort of gauge how college and universities were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's what you're going to see here in a minute as I talk about that. So basically what this is this part of the survey that I'm showing you here is what we would call the top most pressing issues. What we would do is we give college and university presidents a list of anywhere from 15 to 22 issues, depending on where we were in the pandemic. And we'd ask them to select the top 5 most pressing concerns every survey. And so that these would repeat themselves throughout. And so what we're going to talk about is the top of mind, what they consistently said was the top of mind for them during the pandemic and currently. And so this most recent data we have is from November and December of 2021. We currently have a survey in the field right now, and those results will be published in early April. So if you're interested in seeing how these evolve, you'll be able to see those results. But one of the things that you can see here is that mental health of students is the #1 concern of college and university, is most commonly selected top of mind concern by college and university presidents in December and November. And you can see enrollment morale of faculty and staff, retaining faculty and staff, mental health of faculty and staff. These were the issues most commonly selected by college and university presidents. And we continue to go down, and we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of some of these issues throughout the series so that you can get a better grasp on what it looks like from evolution from there to now. And so mental health, we talked a little bit about mental health. Mental health has consistently been one of the top concerns of college and university presidents. More college and university presidents selected mental health as the top of mind concern than any other issue. And that actually was the most cited and most pressing issue starting in September of 2020, which you can see the evolution of the pandemic, right? Where in the beginning, they weren't, we'll see where their focus was, but by September, over 50% of presidents said mental health of my students is my top of mind concern, and topping out at almost 3/4 of presidents saying mental health was a top concern. Also, faculty and staff. Well, it didn't top out as the most commonly selected. It always was in the top 5 of the issues that we were looking at. So college and university presidents put it in their top 5 consistently throughout the pandemic as well. And you can see that sort of trend. And I'll talk about what the 34%, like why it dropped to 1/3 of being concerned about mental health of faculty and staff in December. It's because we're getting a feeling that, are they really concerned about the mental health, or is it about the morale? And so we actually added morale to the survey, and we found that morale actually ranked higher than mental health. And so we were able to parse out that was something that was of pressing concern for our leaders. And you can see here, one of the reasons that, mental health was top of mind throughout the entire series. And you can see why, they said it's more of a priority than it was in previous years. But it also, and one of the reasons why is because in the September of 2021, they were saying 62% of presidents were saying the mental health of my students is worse than it was in previous years. And so you're seeing that one of the reasons why that it's top of mind is because student mental health is getting worse than the presidents saw in previous years, and then also making it more of a priority for them as they were navigating the pandemic. Student enrollment is another thing that has been risen to the top of the mind for presidents. Not only was it's a complex, enrollment's complex. It's not like one of those easy peasy things that you can figure out. Not all of them were concerned about whether or not they would meet their enrollment goals. They were concerned about the different populations of students that were potentially being impacted by the pandemic. They were concerned about being able to recruit and retain students as they dealt with the pandemic. And here you can see the concern about international students and how it fluctuated throughout the pandemic as well. It's also complex because our institutions are not just your typical 18 to 24-year-old students, right? Who goes to a Ivy covered institution and spends 4 years on campus studying on the quad. Actually, in fact, our undergraduate students are so much more diverse than they were even 10 years ago. And 14% only live on campus, and you've got 49% who are actually financially independent, and you've got 36% living at or below the federal poverty line. And so you have this mix of students that are on our campuses. And so enrollment is a complex thing. It's not just recruiting the typical 18 to 24-year-old to campus. It's much more complex than that. 42% are enrolled at two-year colleges or community college campuses. So not all of our campus students are on 4-year college campuses. And you can see, as this slide here from our race and ethnicity report shows you that the demographics of students has shifted from 1995-96 to the most recent federal data that's available to 15-16. And you can see that the share of diverse students has increased between 15-16, and the largest group that's increased is the Hispanic population, which is about a 9.5 percentage point increase from 95-96 to 15-16. And so our institutions are more diverse than they were in even 20 years ago. And one of the things that you can see from this figure here, presidents were asked to identify why they thought what they thought the demographics might look like on their campus, and slightly less than half of presidents indicated they anticipated student demographics would continue to shift. You can see presidents at public two-year institutions were the most likely to report that student demographics were going to continue to shift because of the type of student that attends. More students of color attend community colleges than four-year publics and four-year private institutions. And so as we look at further some of the other issues, COVID-19 and the uncertainty that surrounded it was another top of mind concern. And you can see as things occurred, operating plans was huge in the beginning, right? Nobody knew how to even account for this. And we were wiping off our groceries when we were trying to figure out how do we navigate this, and colleges and universities are trying to figure out, how do I move my classes? Do I have commencement? All these sorts of things in the beginning. And as people got a better grasp on how to operate, you can see the operating plans sort of were not as pressing as they were in the beginning. You can see online learning environment as they got as institutions got a grasp on the online learning environment from early on in the pandemic until later, they were able to sort of ameliorate some of the issues that they were feeling or seeing around that. And you can also see that safety protocols, that was a big thing in July. They were trying to figure out, how are we going to bring students back? Are we going to bring students back? And a lot of students, if you recall, a lot of institutions started remotely in the fall semester because they weren't sure how to necessarily best navigate some of the issues around COVID. And then by the time you get to the December 21, now we've got Omicron, and that is another sort of concern that college and university. So there's so much uncertainty when you're in institutions trying to operate, and that uncertainty really, really made it challenging. That and the uncertainty around the demographics, the uncertainty around mental health. And you can see there were one of the things that we asked presidents was we wanted to see if they thought that they were going to see labor market disruptions that were going to impact their student demographics. And you can see that public two-year institutions were much more likely to agree with that statement. The labor market was pulling a lot of the students because they were not able to continue in their jobs in order to support their families. So they had to make some choices. And you can, in some of the enrollment data around community colleges, you can see is a drop off during COVID, and they actually were much more significantly impacted in their enrollment than four-year publics and four-year private institutions. Faculty and staff retention is also another top of mind issue for our presidents. And you can see one of the things in the beginning of the pandemic, they were concerned they were going to have to lay off faculty, or not faculty, but staff in particular. They were concerned. And then by April 21, we got wind that people were feeling concerned about whether that they were going to be able to recruit, right? Because we started hearing the grumblings and rumblings of people not coming back to academia and making decisions because of the decisions of operating that leaders were making. And so you can see here that recruiting changes, and then you see the morale piece, right? 45% of presidents said they were concerned about the morale, which fell within the top 5 issues associated, top of mind issues associated in December. And then finally, financial viability, which is another complex and very long-term financial viability, right? Is my institution going to be here in 3 to 5 years, 7 years, 15 years, 20 years from now? They were concerned about the financial viability, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see here, 64% of them we're saying, yeah, I'm at this point right now, looking down this pandemic, I don't know what's going to happen to us, right? And then by the time we reached December, they weren't as concerned, but the reason they probably weren't as concerned is because the influx of the HERF money, the Higher Education Relief Act money that came in from the federal government to help buoy some of the COVID-related expenses in keeping staff and services functioning during the pandemic for a lot of the institutions that offset some of the costs associated with those. And lots of other issues came up, right? Like in the survey, I wasn't able to get to all of them, but you can see racial equity issues is up there as a top of mind concern for presidents, especially as you think about George Floyd and the killing spree in Atlanta for our Asian American people. And then you've got the food and housing insecure students as being something that they're thinking about. And you can see this data when you look at it by the sector, which is, I'll drop the link into the website link here in a minute, but you can see it by sector, how much community college presidents in particular are concerned about food and housing insecurity. And then emergency aid was a really big thing too, and especially in the beginning, we asked a lot of questions around emergency aid because students were having a lot of trouble. Were they going to go home? What were they going to do? Their semesters were, or the academic terms were wrapping early. And so it became less of an issue as institutions figured out how to put those programs and services into place, but it is something that was also in the minds of our leaders. And so HERE Act, what I talked about, they really helped to keep students enrolled. It helped to keep college affordable for a lot of different populations of students. It helped alleviate the digital divide for a lot of students by by giving them devices and hotspots and things to keep them enrolled. It helped with offset some of the COVID tests and other healthcare things that were happening on our campuses. And they kept people and it kept a lot of the sector employed. The concern about the layoffs subsided when the HERE funds were able to be implemented and used by our institutions. So that is a big, long sort of overview of some of the issues facing higher education and some of the issues that came up in our Pulsepoint surveys, and happy to start a conversation in the context of all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Chessman. Whoa. That is, I just want us to sit with all that you've just given us for a minute. With all of the issues you've raised, the top 5 issues that you've raised that are top of mind for college and university presidents across the country. Right? And the top issue being student mental health. Yep. I want us to sit with that for a moment. And I want us to take in that you opened your remarks with, you and Dr. Blanchard both, with higher ed being a community, right? And that as human beings, I study Ubuntu and Buddhism, and Ubuntu says that human beings aren't born, but they are made in relationship with other human beings. And so what does that do when we're taken out of relationship to the spirit? What does that do to our humanity, right? Are the questions that really came to mind. There are a whole lot of questions, right? But that spirit question always comes top of mind for me in light of all of that data. And it really helps us to understand in a real way what is driving decision-making on college campuses, right? Either positively or negatively. So I want us to talk a little bit about that, but I want to go to Dr. Blanchard to get her initial sort of reaction to what you presented.
Sure. Also echoing David, just a wow, right? As Dr. Chessman was speaking, I was jotting down notes and I have lines drawn to different things because as Hollie highlighted, so many of these issues are interrelated. So hopefully I can somehow cogently put all my thoughts together. So mental health, topping that list, mental health being on the top of so many lists, right now in our society, enduring a global plague. So many of us so unsure about our physical health, our well-being, losing friends and relatives to this disease, worried about our futures, worried about our financial stability. So mental health was certainly a critical issue prior to COVID with just the typical development that occurs among students, the traditional age students in college, but also the mental health stressors that are non-traditional. I hate to continue using that word because as we see in the statistics, the majority of students are older and part-time. So, I'll just put forward, I come from a 4-year, mostly residential research institution. So most of my experiences and framework comes from that. So I do apologize if at any point I leave out our private institutions, our 2-year colleges, because certainly they all have their own unique challenges. So in my position, I only teach graduate students, or I should say primarily teach graduate students. In the fall, I do teach an undergrad course. So kind of as an aside, and I know David wanted us to talk about, how do we keep ourselves centered and grounded? I joke with people that the only way I will exercise is if someone pays me and they expect me to be there. So, but it's so true, especially when I was on the tenure track, it was so easy for me to say, no, I'm not going to take time out for myself. I need to work on this paper. I need to do that. And so I guess about 4 years ago, I began teaching cycling classes at LSU, because it forced me to, honor some time for myself to maintain some mental and physical well-being. But really, my biggest enjoyment from teaching cycling classes is that I get to interact with undergraduate students in a way I typically don't. And I was just chatting casually with a friend the other day, and she was saying how shocked she was hearing from a college age student sharing how many of their friends were clinically depressed on some type of antidepressant, and this woman, being older, 70 years old, just couldn't believe that so many college students were experiencing such mental health issues. And of course that shows a sign of the times, whereas this woman went to college when it was the traditional age. You were on campus, you were sitting in the quad under the IVs, no care in the world. And so many of our students are working and going to class. They have familial obligations. I highlighted how many of them are living under the poverty level. So I mentioned my teaching cycling classes for a reason, is because I'm in a position of privilege. Teaching cycling courses is really more for fun than for paying bills, even though it does help. I have begun to advocate for the student workers who are the ones who primarily staff our university recreation center. And the pay for these student workers hasn't kept pace with national conversations surrounding minimum wage and whatnot. And unfortunately, I have not been successful yet. I don't want to publicly shame any institution, but I think that is essential for so many institutions. Is it's great to hear that faculty might get raises. I read in the Chronicle today that one institution is looking over the next few years to invest $500 million in faculty raises. But we can't forget the staff, not just the pro staff, but the hourly wage staff and our student workers. Our student workers are stressed because they are trying to pay their rent, buy food, all of these things. And with COVID, a lot of these students couldn't work on campus because campus was closed. And so recognizing that higher ed institutions are an economy. And so that leads into another issue related to faculty and staff. And I love that Hollie's study made a differentiation between mental health and morale. And of course, different words mean different things. So I'm not sure how the survey participants looked at those words, but for me, morale kind of connotes productivity, or perhaps retainment of employees versus true mental health, right? For me, I feel like that might be a difference. So I can just share, I have not particularly felt like my institution, I don't want to say they didn't care about faculty, staff mental health, but it was never part of the conversation. Now, once again, being in a higher education institution, particularly as a faculty member who is salaried, so whether I was on campus or at home, I was going to get paid. The courses were still going on. But that was one of my, I don't want to say frustrations, but perspectives when, campuses, gosh, I lose track of the years now, 2021, or no, sorry, fall 20, when we were trying to decide for the first time, would we come back to campus or not? And of course, a lot of folks were truly and validly worried about their health or their family's health. But, when institutions are closed, particularly the, institutions like mine that are traditional brick and mortar, we're an economy. So the hourly wage staff, they're not working. The student employees, they're not working. The restaurants, the apartment complexes that, rely on students being in a college town like mine, that impacted their financial well-being as well. So I felt that was something, that faculty needed to keep in mind, that we definitely were in a position of privilege. Our healthcare workers, our grocery store workers, they never had the option to work at home online, right? You can't stock the grocery shelves from home using Zoom. Another thing, sorry, but going back to the mental health, I definitely feel my institution, and I'm sure at other institutions, faculty and staff would feel the same, is that a lot more was piled upon us, yet the expectations never shifted. So this is my spring break week, and I thought I was going to finish a paper this week, which faculty are judged by research productivity. And of course, I'm fortunate to do a job that I love and brings in a steady income. But I paused today when I was getting ready for this presentation, and I was like, what, it is Thursday. But because of all the service and administrative things that just trickle in all day long, I haven't gotten my research done, which is fine by me. But when I go up for evaluation by my peers and my supervisors, they're still going to expect the same amount. Another thing, so moving away from mental health, and once again, I think it is important to note, and I'll be curious to hear others' thoughts about whether universities were truly concerned about faculty staff mental health, or was it more just keeping us placated and pacified so that we wouldn't leave. Because certainly, there becomes an issue when you start losing employees and losing the skills and the organizational memory that goes with them. Another issue, that Dr. Chessman highlighted was enrollment. And for me, that definitely is multi-layered. Recently, in one of the trade magazines, Chronicle of Higher Ed, Inside Higher Ed, there was a story about the massification of master's degrees. So higher education administration is a graduate-only discipline. And at many places, you will find extremely large master's programs. My institution, no exception. And during COVID, we saw just an overnight exponential increase in applications, particularly for our online program. Which on one side was great, right? That students were retooling within the changing economy, and if they had been unemployed, were utilizing that time to further their skill set. But post-COVID, we've cranked out all of the, and I'm just speaking of my discipline, but this would go for so many other disciplines as well. Social work, I read some institutions have come under fire for just how large they allow their social work master's programs to become. And so we produce all these students. We use it as a cash cow, really. Universities, particularly research institutions like mine, want to keep the PhD programs small so that we can focus on research productivity. But we want to bring in as many master's students as possible because it's easy to run those courses and very little advisement needed. And so I had this concern pre-COVID is, are in an effort to bring in revenue, are we doing a great disservice to the students, because will the market bear so many master's level graduates? And like I had that concern prior to COVID, and saw, sadly, many examples of that, where students went into debt to pursue this degree or other graduate degrees and couldn't find work that was worthy of their diplomas. Sorry, like I said, my notes are all over the place and one line leading to the next. But as far as enrollment and financial viability, so one of the key issues from the president's was financial viability. So I do fear that they will use the online programs, particularly to supplant enrollment trends and get more funds. I'm also worried that that universities will continue to exploit adjuncts at a greater pace and at a greater rate. With financial viability being a concern, I wonder if our student workers and staff will continue to work for low wages that keep them under the poverty level. Another thing, so I mentioned, so many of our students are living under the poverty level. They are their parents, they work. And so for student services, I think it is incumbent upon that sector within the industry to really rethink, right? So in my short career in student affairs, one position I had was student activities. I planned movies, concerts, and speakers. Well, in the online forum, obviously that's not really something that students are interested in. But for our older working students, what are the things that they truly need as far as support to help them get through college, to maintain their wellness? We have to think outside of the box beyond, speakers and concerts and those fun things that we always plan for our more traditional age students. Another thing, we were talking about equity, and Hollie mentioned the digital divide. For our K through 12 students who were at home for 2 years, who either didn't have easy access to online education, didn't have a person in the home to assist with their learning, that's going to carry over to higher education in 10 or so years, right? And so I think higher education institutions need to be prepared for those students, to receive those students who were at an educational disadvantage during the years of remote learning in the K through 12 sector. The K through 12 sector is divided by, it discriminates based on wealth. So many school districts are divided by neighborhoods that disproportionately contribute to the tax base. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has ruled, at least for now, that it is legal to fund school districts differently based on property taxes. And so that's why we see within one county or one area, school districts being well funded and 5 miles away being very under-resourced. So that's something that higher education needs to be prepared for, to respond to. And then finally, politics. So talking about healing, our nation is more divided than ever, and COVID was one of those divisive issues. And so for campuses, whether or not we were coming back to campus was a political issue. Whether or not we would require masks was a political issue. It was in Georgia, it was in Louisiana, in so many places. I went to graduate school at the University of Georgia, so I particularly followed along with this in the news, but the state of Georgia prohibited faculty members from requiring students to wear a mask, even, contra to what the CDC was recommending at the time. And so politics will continue to play a part in higher education, whether it's via COVID, what we teach in classrooms, such as, the attack on critical race theory, So the politicalization of higher education, I think, is something that we can anticipate will stick around for some bit. So I'll hush there. Like I said, I love how all of these issues, just really overlap and show, show how many of these issues are truly interrelated across campus, across sectors, and even across K through 12 and higher education.
Yeah, thank you for that. You brought up a number of interesting topics, right? And what came to mind, what was most present of mind for me in your remarks, Dr. Blanchard, was my own critique of institutions of higher education, right? And so in an African cosmology, a Southern African cosmology, right, to critique something is actually a sign of great respect, because it shows that you care, you are present with it. And what it reads to me, and even in looking at the data that Hollie, Dr. Chessman, you presented, is that we are living in a moment, and maybe we've always lived in a moment, but now we're very aware of it, of politically saturated epistemological regimes of fear at institutions, right, that are market driven and not people centered. That's what's coming up for me. And that in order to be healed, there has to be a wound of some sort, right? A physical wound, a spiritual wound. There's some sort of wounding happening. And I want us to talk more, and we'll get to some of these questions in the Q&A, about our speculation. And Hollie, you may have data on this, right? But around some of those wounds that higher education as a system are causing, right? Again, this Confronting the Issue series, right, raises all of the issues, and then we'll go through each one by one throughout the entire series. But what are the wounds, right? And I can go on and on about my own wounds from from higher education as a faculty member, as a member of the Great Resignation class, and as a doc student, right? And how that process wounded me personally, but also as a faculty member and an administrator, right? Where the pressure was being poured on in moments where we were all stressed. Go ahead, Dr. Chessman.
So I think, to your question about wounds, I think it gets to the larger question of like looking at the root systemic causes, I think, of what you're talking about, right? Like, I feel like ideal worker norms that are so prevalent in higher education, where we are asked, especially as student affairs professionals, to center work at all costs. It costs to our family, it costs to our own mental health and well-being. I think Sue typed a question into the Q&A here earlier about just the demands that are placed on our staff and on our faculty as well, but particularly on our staff. I think about our housing staff during COVID. Lord have mercy, like what they had to do and what they had to go through with RAs policing masks and RAs running COVID floors, like how challenging that was for those students. And to your question about wounds, there will be wounds from having in some trauma from having to go through that. I think COVID in and of itself is going to be is providing collective trauma to society as a whole, but I think there's specific and unique traumas that are happening on our college campuses around COVID. To your point about Georgia and the mask mandates and having to go head to head with students who say, well, I don't need to wear a mask. I don't care if you're immunocompromised, right? Because my governor says I don't have to. I think those are some of the things that are causing some of the wounds, right? Instead of being in community and centering the well-being of ourselves and each other, we are more concerned about our rights and our and so I could go on and on about, collectivist versus individualist, consciousness. But I think one of the things that you see in other wounds that I'm thinking about in higher ed is really sort of, going back to the presentation I gave earlier, the financial viability, right? What we've got institutions that are concerned about whether or not they're going to be here, and that causes uncertainty for faculty and whether or not their programs are going to be eliminated, or whether their research dollars are going to be cut, or whether or not our staff are going to have a job when they show up. I have many colleagues, unfortunately, in student affairs, who came to work one day and found out they didn't have a job as before the end of the day that day. So I think the financial viability of institutions and, personnel typically is one of the most expensive pieces of that college and university's foot, right? So it's one of those things that, the wounds, if you will, are, uncertainty causes some of the wounds. The trauma causes some of the wounds. And I think higher education is a system and it's a structure, and it's, there's ways that I think it could be, structured better if we centered people and we centered the well-being and we centered, our humanity in some of these systems and structures. I think we would see a different sort of organization and a different sort of system.
Could not agree more. And the research says that we saw this shift happening, right? And it's been happening for 5 decades. I think the last time I picked up the UCLA freshman survey, you see the shift at UCLA around the time that Ronald Reagan becomes governor of California, where there's this drastic change. And then you see it increase when he becomes president in the 80s, right? There's this drastic change from students answering the question roughly, right? I'm coming to this institution of higher learning to understand and to live a better life, right? To gain knowledge and to live a better life, versus I'm coming to this institution for economic mobility, right? And to be more wealthy. And that has driven, it feels like, at least from my opinion, every decision, right, that institutions have made in terms of who they are, how they do what they do, and who they endeavor to become in the world, right? And so you mentioned this notion of collectivism versus individualism, and I think that is a wound. That is a national wound, right? That we live in such an individualistic, atomistic society that we have forgotten that everything that we do affects someone else, right? We are a part of a whole. And that's playing out in these little microcosms of society on college campuses across the country, right? I don't give a damn about what you have to do over there. We want to have this party. We're not wearing masks, right? We don't care if the whole campus gets sick. We're going to do it anyway. Those things are occurring on a daily basis, those types of decisions. And then those students go out into the world and become our leaders. They become Congress people. Don't get me started. Okay. Don't get me started. Let's go to a question from Q&A. So Liz asked Dr. Chessman, it's fascinating to see what is top of mind for presidents. Are you aware of parallel data as to what issues are top of mind for students from their perspective?
I am not as aware of that. Like there are lots of surveys that, especially the surveys that we paid attention, or I particularly paid attention to, because my area of focus is student mental health and well-being, is sort of some of what students are reporting around what they're looking for from their institutions and what they're looking for from the leadership. Active Minds does a really great job of this. The Steve Fund, especially around students of color, they did a task force where they looked at, especially for students of color during COVID-19, what supports and needed to be in place for the emotional and well-being of our students of color during COVID. So some of there are organizations out there that are doing this work. around mental health in particular. I don't know if there's there's quite a few surveys. I think Salesforce did a survey, Strata did a survey during the pandemic that really looked at what students were thinking, and they asked, a lot of the questions were around, are you thinking about going back? What's your sort of decision? What is going to influence your decision to return to college in the fall? So we were doing a lot of looking at the environment, because we sort of wanted to be able to help our presidents respond to what students were thinking. But that was early on in the pandemic. I think some of those things subsided as survey fatigue really set in for folks. And I'm not aware of any most really super current stuff, but I know there's probably some out there. Maybe somebody can drop something in the chat that they've seen, but I can drop into the chat some of the surveys that we did around public opinion of higher education, but that's a little more broad than it is from a student perspective.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And that question, that's a necessary question, right? Most of our membership, if I'm correct, are faculty members, former faculty members, former administrators. And even what I was noticing at the institution that I was at, serving on the Academic Affairs Council, right, there was a lot of focus on take care of the students, take care of the students, take care of the students, make sure they're great, make sure they're great. And I would raise every time that came up that you've not asked once about how faculty and staff are doing, right? You've not asked once about, you're putting, again, and Joy, you mentioned this, you're putting all of these pressures on us. And you've not even asked me how I'm doing. Right, but because, as Michael Apple says, it's become an educational supermarket, right, driven by consumers. You're worried about the consumer, but not about the producer, which makes no sense to me, because if the producer is ill, right, if the producer is no longer there, then how are you going to maintain these consumers, right? And we'll talk about that on the 31st in our faculty conversation. But what I want to say is that what I recognized in those conversations was that administrators too forgot that faculty were human beings. And students, the research tells us this, students don't view faculty members as human beings. They do not think you have emotions. They do not think you have stresses. They do not think you have all of those things, because you become part of a machine, right? And so the way you operate is machinic, and that's just really wrong. And that's a wound for me that obviously I need to work out in therapy some more, or with you all tonight. So I want to ask this question from Bonnie Tester. Bonnie says, thank you for this webinar. Can you speak to any ways that the data shows people are finding value in higher education? I'm curious about how the perceived value or values or benefits of higher ed may be in relationship to the institutional struggles you both discussed.
I mean, I think the value of higher education in particular, and I dropped into the chat earlier, a link to the article in Inside Higher Ed that sort of looks at the public opinion of higher education, right? And what people are thinking. The economic value of a college degree. I mean, that's what a lot of it comes down to is the time and then the money worth what we get at the end of the journey, right? We know that student debt is paid by a lot of people who have some college and no degree, right? And so having that conversation around is value of college worth it? And right now people are still seeing that there is an economic value in higher education, I think, but it goes back to the economics, like you said, David, like Reagan coming in and everyone's like, yeah, I'm not really as interested in the social benefits and the internal benefits of higher ed. I'm more concerned about, at the economic mobility piece. And that's sort of where we've been focusing a lot of our energy, is on the economic mobility piece in higher education, what kind of jobs you can get, what sort of internships you can apply to, those sorts of things. I think that's, we that's what parents want to hear. They want to hear that, you know, we've saved and scrimped and saved for all these years to send my son or daughter to school, or I'm working 70 hours a week so I can pay for my tuition. They want to hear like, what's the end result? Yeah, I'll be a better human, but you know, I need to eat more than ramen, right? So I think that's part of the struggle and the push and the pull associated with that. And I think, you know, I think that's where it sort of gets to as well. I'm sure Joy has some things that she'd like to say too.
No, just some reflections. I haven't looked at the data, and I'll be honest. So David mentioned earlier, my research focus primarily is on higher education law. So unfortunately, I tend to look at things in black and white, and you know, it's so true what David mentioned is, you know, instead of being a machine, we have to focus more on the people. So to the question of, you know, how do students view the value of college? You know, just in my own experience, you know, it's different things for different people, and I think all of those reasons need to be valued by their respective institutions. So I mentioned earlier, I primarily teach graduate students, but once a year I have an undergrad course. Well, in fall of 20, faculty had a choice at my institution to be on campus or online, and I chose to be on campus. I felt that the protections, you know, the distance, the masking, I felt safe. And I also recognized, you know, that so many of my neighbors in society didn't have that choice to work from home. So I went back to campus, and for my undergraduate students, they were, so many of them expressed, you know, thank you, you were my only on-campus class. And so here were the 18-year-olds who had spent their senior, you know, the end of their senior year online, and they were looking for that quote unquote college experience. Whereas now, 2 years later, so many of our graduate students would like to have that online option because they work full time. They have family obligations. Some of them are coming from a great distance, right? So, you know, particularly when it comes to research institutions, so many of those are not, you know, within a 30-minute drive. And so the ability to do those things online should perhaps be an option. For some students, the value of college is that collegiate experience, and that should be honored. But for some, it is just the value of earning a better living, and that is certainly fine as well. Particularly when it comes to social and economic mobility for people who previously didn't have those options. And so going back to some of David's earlier comments, you know, so much focus is on the bottom line, the finances, but I think it really truly is incumbent upon presidents and boards to focus on, okay, what are the needs of the people within our organization? And those things don't have to necessarily ignore the financial strictures and limits. But if we look at those things, I think we're producing a quote unquote better product. So prior to moving to Louisiana, I was in Florida, and kind of infamously at the time, then Governor, now Senator Rick Scott, wanted to eliminate degrees in some of the social sciences. I can't remember if it was sociology or anthropology. And the irony there was his daughter had actually received a degree in that. And so many institutions are focusing on the employability of students, which of course is important. But I see, even at my own institution, our new president is putting forth his areas of priority. So much is focused on where's the money, STEM and artificial intelligence and all these things. And so just the disciplinary inquiry, I think, is being put aside, you know, seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake, and institutions are putting their priorities where the money is. And then another, going back to the value of college, and it goes back to just kind of one of my personal gripes with higher ed is the blurring of the lines of the mission of the institution. So I was previously at Florida International University. It opened in the 70s as the upper level junior and senior courses for students transferring from Miami-Dade College. Fast forward 40 years, it's a wonderful institution. It achieved research very high classification, has a medical school, has a law school with the highest bar passage rate. All of those things are wonderful, but in becoming an elite research institution, who did they leave behind? Has the higher ed community made up for the access to, the access that previously was there for the South Florida community that has now been taken up by the selectivity that comes about when you are a research institution? So once again, that's one of my things is I think institutions should really focus on, what is it that we're here to do? Some of them are there for the traditional college experience. Some institutions are for open access and financial mobility, but too many institutions, and it's institutions I've been at, want to do all things. They want to crush the market competition, and in that process, they are overburdening faculty and staff. They're exploiting cheap labor, and unfortunately, I don't think they're serving all of their students well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to move to a question from Sue Rickers, because I think this question also sort of aligns here. And Sue says more of an awareness than a question. Then Sue asks a question at the end, so just bear with me. Bear with me here. I work at a 4-year public institution. Balancing my own mental health and tuning into and being present for student mental health needs at the same time is challenging. I have a visceral desire to, quote, get back to normal. Show up to class, be prepared, turn in assignments on time, engage, and that isn't where many of the students in my classes are at. As a classroom community, we're in need of more time, more attention, more support, and at times it's draining for Sue. And Sue says, don't get me started on demands from administration. We won't get you started on that, Sue. Sue then says, if there's a question in all of that, we think it's this. I think it was, are there any suggestions or thoughts about how to create a healing environment as a community rather than as an individual faculty member? Do we have any thoughts on that?
I don't know if I have an answer, but I did, while someone else was speaking, I was reading through the chat and the questions. And, once again, I study law. And so I unfortunately don't take enough time to think about these broader issues enough. But I love what CMind does, so I feel comfortable sharing this. So at the start of fall of 21, once again, time is amorphous these days. 2 days before the start of the fall semester, my family received word that my father was terminally ill. And 2 days after the start of the semester, I moved him an hour and a half, he and my mom, into my home for him to receive hospice care. And for those of you who are familiar with, traditional research faculty teach at 2-2 load. I was teaching 4 in the fall because usually I do the honors college overload, and then because of a shortage of staff, I took on a 4th, not knowing what was to come. And then, of course, when things went south with my dad's health, I, wanted to stay strong and, didn't want to cancel classes, didn't want to, disadvantage the students' experience. So one thing that I have shifted from is pre-COVID. I joke that I'm kind of like that professor from Legally Blonde, that I'm tough in class, but, much different out of class. Was, as a woman and as someone who was younger when I started my career, I felt like I had to, be an enforcer. And so I had attendance policies. And if you didn't come to class, you'd lose 2 points and blah, 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 blah. Recognizing that I'm not sure when I'll be able to come to class because of my dad's health, I did away with that, and I will permanently keep that. I mean, obviously, I will encourage students to come to class, and there will be some accountability there, but for me, gone are the days of taking away points. So, that's just one example. But I think faculty, staff, institutions need to re-examine their policies, their approaches, to just stop and say, okay, we are all living life. And what sort of grace can we give everyone and still provide the education and the experience that everyone wants. I saw in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, one of them, that the University of Oregon issued a statement that basically, they're back to normal, back to business, and that there would be no accommodations for attendance and distance learning and things like that. And so whether that's a good or a bad idea, I don't know. I don't really have an opinion, but I definitely think, having come through COVID and other stressors in our society, whether it be race, politics, you name it, hopefully all of us as a collective community in higher education will come out of it with a greater sense of humanity in what we do, instead of focusing on money and, what product are we producing, who are the people that we're dealing with, and how can we, make this a better environment for all of them.
Thank you for sharing.
Part of what I wonder too is, I think one of the things that COVID has shown us is that community is of the utmost and it's important. And so, to Sue's question, I wonder, so we think about contemplative practice and the ability of it to positively impact our emotional and mental well-being, and with regular, with even not even just, it doesn't even to be regular, even just the check-in that David did, gave us a moment of calm and peace. And so, and shutting off the gerbil and the wheel in our heads. I wonder if there's an opportunity, in this moment, to draw on contemplative practice in community with others, right? Like, is there an opportunity for Sue to reach out to colleagues that she knows shares some of the contemplative mindset and the contemplative frame, to say, let's get together in community and let's do yoga, or let's do a mindfulness meditation and talk about ways that we can systemically start to think about how we change some of the things that are impacting our health and well-being. And it's not an easy answer. I think one of the things that, even being in a room with 22 college and university presidents from various institutions on Tuesday, one of the things that they were thinking about is, like, how do we do this at scale? How do we support the well-being and the mental health of students in a way that's sustainable and scalable? And I don't, nobody in the room had answers. If we all had answers to that, we would be, we'd be on a yacht out in the, Turks and Caicos. But I think one of the things that I'm, to Sue's point, is there ways to develop the community in contemplative practice that we can use to help mobilize change and mobilize the healing that we're looking for in higher education, and thinking about centering ourselves and centering our common humanity in that sort of approach?
Yeah, that's exactly, both of you, that's what we're trying to get to, right? Our friend from UGA asked in the chat, what do we mean by healing? And I think both of you just perfectly described dimensions of healing, right? It's my belief that institutions have being, right? They have being. And being, the being of the institution needs to be healed, right? Are they in alignment with their original mission? Has that changed? Are they being honest about that change, right? In order for something to be healed, there has to be a fragmentation, a rupture, a wound that needs to be repaired. And so the basic assumption that we're working off of here, right, is that a wound, a rupture, a fragmentation has occurred within the system of higher education in this country. Now, it didn't cause itself, right, is what we understand, but there are pressures, external pressures, as well as internal pressures for these things to change, primarily, as we talked about tonight, driven by economics in the market. This is an ecosystem conversation in the middle of a larger ecosystem, in a conversation that we have to have about nationalism, right? In a conversation that we have to have about politics and democracy. And democracy, as John Dewey said, being an associated mode of living, right? And we ain't living no damn associated mode. Is this a democracy? There are several fragmentations that have occurred, right? We're focusing on this one because this is where potentially, and I had this conversation with the staff earlier, and this is why are we focusing particularly on higher education? This doesn't make any sense to us. We should be focusing on society. And my response was, as a researcher, my research brain says that if I can find an ecosystem microcosm that mirrors the larger whole, right? Higher education institutions mirror the larger society. And if I can introduce interventions into that microcosm, then potentially, if they work, I can scale and replicate them to the larger society, right? Not to mention that institutions of higher learning, as I said earlier, are educating our future leaders, are educating our future doctors, that's a little scary sometimes, are educating our future judges, lawyers, politicians, professors, researchers, contemplative scholars, and practitioners, right? This is where it's happening. This is where the future of society rests in a number of ways, which is why we're focusing there, okay? Again, that's a lot of assumptions to be made. And some of those assumptions are based on experience, and some of them are based on research, and some of them are based on intuition. But what I think the three of us know, and those who have joined us tonight understand, is that contemplative practice has the potential to heal and transform the individual, the collective, the institution, and the system, sometimes simultaneously, right? As we change, the system is mandated to change, right, in process. Okay, I want to thank the two of you for being here tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Before I close, please be reminded to take our evaluation survey in the chat. They'll drop that in the chat shortly. And of course, if you have your credit cards handy and are able, we welcome a donation to CMind to keep this program and our work going. Again, please allow me to extend my sincerest gratitude to tonight's presenters for an informative and eye-opening conversation. Tonight's program was just one dimension of our grappling with the question of how we might catalyze healing to transform higher education into what it is not yet but must become if we are to live together peacefully, respect the planet, and uplift the human spirit. There can be no healing without confronting the issues. Tonight, I hope we've shed light on the issues and will now begin to confront them and to deconstruct them one by one. I invite you to join us on Thursday, March 31st, for Healing Higher Ed, Embodying the Institution, with Dr. Maria Hamilton Abagunde and Dr. Ricardo Montalonga. Again, that's Thursday, March 31st. You know, at the beginning of the year, this struck me as we were going through this. At the beginning of the year, someone said the same words that one of our folks might ask, when are we going to return to our new normal? This is our new normal. And I remember writing these words, if you'll just bear with me. And it reads this: there is nothing normal about this new. We are in the midst of a global pandemic, struggling to survive in an empire that views our bodies and our well-being as commodities. machines of consumption for the proliferation of capitalism. We knew this, we being people of the global majority knew this. But now, maybe you too understand. Your value is your production. Know this feeling of invisible humanity. We are human beings. We are tired. We are the universe in miniature experiencing itself atrophy in real time. How can we not be stretched to the end of our faith? Emotionally weary, physically exhausted, and mentally pushed beyond the limits of the rivers of our mind onto its desolate outer banks. Sit, give rest, breathe, cry, sob, walk, run, imagine, pray. I still believe that hope is on the way. Until we meet again, be well, be still, trust in the infinite, remember our shared humanity, be community, and be of good courage. Good night.